Lindsey Drager is the author of 4 books of fiction, all published by Dzonk: The Sorrow Proper, 2015, The Lost Daughter Collective, 2017, The Archive of Alternate Endings, 2019, and The Avian Hourglass, 2024. These books have won a Shirley Jackson Award, been finalists for 2 Lambda Literary Awards, and have variously been translated into Spanish and Italian. Recent fiction can be found or is forthcoming in conjunctions: the Iowa Review, the Southern Review, Kenyon Review, Colorado Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. A 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship recipient in prose, winner of the 2022 Bard Fiction Prize, and recipient of a 2025 Pushcart Prize, she is currently a faculty member in the Creative Writing Program at University of Utah and the fiction editor of West Branch Literary Journal. She is a collector of vintage cameras, a person who collages, someone who runs, and a very amateur gardener. On a personal note, I love Drager's short story Rainmaker and how it makes me think about the reasons why I write, what I might be holding back, and how to quash my inhibitions. Please join me in welcoming Lindsey Drager to BYU's English Reading Series.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. And generally speaking, just a huge thanks to everyone for being here today. What a beautiful day, and you're here and here listening to me read, so thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Samantha Sorensen and Joey Franklin for coordinating things, and it's just a pleasure to be on your campus today. I am going to give a little bit of an overview, some thinking behind what went into this latest project of mine called The Avian Hourglass. I'm going to read a little bit from that, but first I want to give you just a little bit of context, what went into the thinking of the book, some of the kind of issues I was negotiating while writing it, and then I'm going to show you some slides that were informative to the production of the structure of the book. And then I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll get you out of here by 12:50, because I know you've got class. So to begin with, The Avian Hourglass, it's a kind of creative enactment of 2 different ideas that I was thinking through, grappling with, that are kind of situated in theory. The first is this idea of solastalgia, which is actually a portmanteau, a mix of 2 different words, of solace and nostalgia. And this is a term that was coined in 2005 by a philosopher and eco-theorist, Glenn Albrecht, and he was thinking about solastalgia, solace and nostalgia, in relation to the climate emergency. So that was sort of one thing that was in the back of my mind. It's informed a lot of my shorter work, and this book kind of emerged thinking about that idea of solastalgia. This book also emerged from thinking through a theory by a literary scholar and social theorist, Lauren Berlant, who in 2011 wrote a book called Cruel Optimism. Cruel optimism, by her definition, is when we desire something that is actually an obstacle to our flourishing. So this desire for something that is actually the thing that doesn't allow us to succeed in life. And so I was thinking about these 2 things and thinking a lot about failure in home, which is in large part what this book is about. But this is kind of the theoretical scaffolding behind this project. So The Avian Hourglass is an allegorical novel. It's very much, it feels very fairy tale-esque. It's very folkloric. And it kind of follows a first-person narrator. I'll talk a little bit about first person in a minute. First-person narrator who's going through like a series of different existential crises. There are so many I have to write them out. So the first is she is dealing with the unrequited love of her childhood best friend. She is a bus driver who's about to lose her job to automation. Her job is, there's a self-driving bus that's going to take over her job. She gave birth to triplets as a surrogate mother. And in the middle of her pregnancy, the parents tragically died in a car accident, so she decided to raise the triplets herself. There's also, she desperately wants to be a radio astronomer. She wants so desperately to be a radio astronomer, and there's a test that she has to take, sort of like the SAT or ACT, to allow her to pursue school, to realize her dream. And she cannot pass this test. She has taken it 4 different times. She now has this is the last opportunity to take this test and pass. She can't do it. Everyone in her town, remember this is a little bit allegorical, everyone in her town, as a kind of rite of passage, the liminal kind of test to move into adulthood. Children, young adults need to choose between yes or no, these two kind of binary worldviews. And she has to choose yes or no. She just can't decide which she is. Everyone else in her community has made this decision. She can't. So she's going through all of these existential crises, all of which kind of culminate in this larger idea of the crisis, which is a little bit ambiguous, but it's in relation to all these local personal problems and also more global problems. And of course, birds have disappeared. The avian hourglass birds have disappeared from her world. So all of this is sort of shaping her. She's very distraught, and this is kind of the crux of the conflict of the book. So the book is really about failure, kind of global and also personal the test, but global, thinking through questions of politics and also the climate emergency. And I also think the book is a little bit about home, what we mean when we think about home, the planet, the nation, our communities, our families, and even our own bodies as a kind of home, like Freud's the unhomely, the unheimlich. So that's all the kind of thinking that went into the book. It's also a retelling of Pinocchio, or if you're familiar with Pinocchio, we know Pinocchio, right? So that did not work, okay? When I thought I was retelling Pinocchio, it did not work when I actually sat down to write it. But I do think there are these like echoes of the story of Pinocchio and the idea of a puppet that are kind of framing what's going on throughout the book. For me, I was thinking a lot about puppets more generally, and then characters in our fiction. I'm assuming there are many fiction writers out there, so I'm talking specifically to you right now. You know, are the characters in our books merely puppets for us as authors to be kind of manipulating in front of the theater of the reader, or the implied reader on the other end? Or do our characters have a little more agency? Do they actually, and I'm sure that you've experienced this in your writing, do they actually kind of teach you, the author, like where they want to go and what they want to do in your story? This was a central question for me as I was sort of working through this. And while I know that characters are linguistic constructions, they're not autonomous human flesh beings, I was thinking about, you know, what are the ethics of our relationship as authors to our characters? And what, you know, oftentimes we put them through pretty terrible things. I mean, this is sort of the guts of fiction, is conflict, right? And so I was just thinking through that and asking myself a couple questions with regard to, you know, what if our characters understood that they were inside of a story, like a puppet recognizing someone's controlling them? How would that relationship between the author and the character sort of operate? What would be the dynamic of that if a character knew that they were under the control of you as the author? All of this is to say the book's a little meta. There's a little bit of metafiction going on, thinking about the story that is aware of its identity of a story, a character who's aware of their identity as a character within the book. So some of that was shaping my thinking. And then the last thing I'll say, back to point of view. This is the first project that I've tackled in first person. Every book before this has been in third person. We know third person is like magical because you're omniscient. You get access to the past, to the future. You're really sort of all-knowing, all-seeing. And that allows you and privileges you the ability to get into any character's brain and sort of assume that the action or the experiences, you get to sort of explore what that looks like from a myriad of different characters. First person, I found out, is far more constricting, which is strange to me because I had always sort of assumed and had been told first person is actually like really freeing because it's the most similar POV to what we do every day. We kind of operate as first person characters in our own sort of narrative. So this idea of moving into first, for me, felt very constricting because I was really constrained to one POV. And that, I think, also sort of was a really unique challenge for me and something that really shaped what happened on the page. I also want to show you some pictures of bird nests. Can I do that? Are you on board with that? Okay. Here's why I want to show you them, because because bird nests were really integral to thinking through the structure of this book. Look at that. Okay, we have got it happening. So there, in this really strange allegorical world that I'm about to tell you about, there are a series of kind of human-sized bird nests that are being constructed by a mysterious, no one really knows, this is one of the subplots. No one really knows who's making these bird-sized nests. And in fact, they are kind of popping up all over town. And really, I would say the origin story of this project was me kind of falling in love with bird nests. And I'll be honest, this is like my pandemic novel. I was looking out my window during the pandemic. It was like, oh, there are birds, right? Like I had this sort of epiphanic. So in my story, of course, there aren't birds, but so much of my thinking and research and kind of like qualitative research, even just looking out my window and really, really trying to sort of digest how I wanted the structure of this book to kind of come out, it was really influenced by bird nest architecture, which you can see is in fact, and I'll show you a couple more photos, like always sort of circular. There's always this sort of like vessel-y kind of circularness going on in bird nest architecture, no matter what it looks like. So here we have the yellow warbler, which you'll hear me talk about in just a couple minutes. And then the satin bowerbird over here on the right, all that blue stuff is actually garbage, human garbage that the bird has collected to sort of prompt the interest of a lover. I'm gonna see if this will move. Okay, here we go. Okay. Barn swallow on the left, which is I'm really familiar with having grown up in the Midwest. And then the weaver bird on the right. You can see all of these are kind of vessel-y, very circular. And so this was hugely important for the structure of this book, which ended up being basically a circle. So the story kind of counts down from 180 down to 1, and then it starts over. And this is not really, I'm not telling you anything that you won't be able to see just by flipping through. So the story itself kind of does this strange loop. And in fact, that's fundamentally a product of looking at and thinking through the construction, the architecture, the design of these bird nests. Again, the book is about home. A nest is a kind of home. Bird nests are supposed to be ephemeral. They're supposed to fall apart. Birds build these nests whenever they're about to lay eggs. So to some extent, our ideas as humans about home, very, very in conflict with that. Our ideas about home are much more concrete and stable than these sort of ephemeral bird nests. So I wanted to sort of think about the ways in which nature, the natural world, could shape or influence not just the structure, but also the content of a project. I'm gonna give you, this is the common tailor bird. Is this amazing or what? Like nature. Phew. The common tailor bird uses the beak to pop these holes into the side of a leaf and then uses spider webs, plant fuzz, and a variety of other things to kind of literally tie together this leaf to then create a space for their young. So I was just enamored of the ingenuity and the brilliance of bird nests and trying to think about a world without birds in this book. So I'm gonna let us look at this while I read. I think all you need to know in this excerpt, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read a couple little bitty chunks across the book. It'll feel more like I'm curating some lines of thinking. And I think all you need to know is that one of the characters, Yuri, he is living next to the narrator who does not have a name. She just goes by I. This is a privilege and a constraint of first person. They share a duplex, and Yuri is trying to write a play about the crisis, that ambiguous kind of looming, dreadful thing. And he's basically rewriting Icarus, the story of Icarus. How many of you are familiar with the story of Icarus? Yeah. Piece of cake, brilliant. So there's a little bit of illusion going on here. And that, I believe, is all you need to know. That was an incredibly long intro, but I'm hoping that it'll prime this reading, which is going to be pretty short, And then if you have any questions about research, about fiction, about first person, third person, thinking through theory as it's informing fiction, I would love to hear those at the end. Okay. Also, if we have time, I have all the covers of the book that got chucked, so we can talk a little bit about that too. I'll show those after the reading. And talk a little bit about why we ended up with the cover that we did. Okay. The massive nests began to sprout around our town a week or so after the eclipse. So far, there are 4, each about the size of a garden shack. When the first nest surfaced, we found it strange, then beautiful. But after a few days of regular visits, an older one among us, Sulian, who used to birdwatch back when there were birds, took notice of the construction. It's uncanny. Look here. It perfectly mimics a real yellow warbler nest. The hard, larger sticks and branches on the outside for sturdiness when situated in the tree. Then the weave of soft grasses toward the center. The structure tall and deep. And also the floor, hair and fur and plant fuzz to ensure the eggs won't break, to confirm the chicks stay warm. It's a mystery, Yuri exclaimed. It's extraordinary, I replied. It's a memorial to a lost species, Sulian said, and I think we should get in. The 3 of us climbed into the deep divot in the middle and looked up at the sky. Is this what it was like to be a bird? Yuri asked. Don't anthropomorphize, Sulian told us. No one knew what it meant to be a bird, and no one will ever know now. Another nest surfaces a week later, attached to the side of the elementary school. I see it from the windows of the bus, and when my shift is over and I get home, I ask Yuri to feed the triplets so I can investigate. Works for him, he says, since he needs to know their new thoughts on the ending he's drafted for the play. When I arrive at the nest, Sulian is already there inspecting the work. Did you know time operated more slowly for birds? Really all animals with high metabolism and small bodies. I look up, and it has suddenly started to drizzle. For them, a single drop of rain falling was sluggish. Imagine. Sulian opens his umbrella and gestures for me to join him underneath. See here? He lets his hand run along the side of the nest. It's made of something that looks like stucco. It's a perfect replica of a barn swallow nest, just scaled up and reinforced at the bottom. Probably since humans are more dense than birds. I think the artist wants them to be used. Are we calling the maker an artist? I asked him, and he shrugs. I touch the outside of the nest, feel the texture of the hardened mud mixed with thick grasses and hay. What would you say the visual field for a human is? He asks. I lean down to tie my shoe, and he squats, keeping the umbrella over me. Maybe 90 degrees? It's 120, including peripheral vision. But pigeons? Pigeons had a visual field of 300 degrees. Imagine how you would be changed by seeing that much, he says. He stays squatting, so I do too. Makes you consider how, based on your position in the world, your understanding of it differs. He looks up at the nest towering above us. There's no single reality, just a warping, weaving cluster of the real. Slowly we rise together and stand, listening to the rain on the umbrella, admiring the human-sized nest. Then, very suddenly, he hands me the umbrella and gets inside. It was the bones, he says, patting the space next to him, that made birds less dense than humans. I give him back the umbrella and get in too, and we can see across the way that the sun is setting. But I understand then what he means. The sun isn't doing anything. It's the earth that moves. The bones of birds were empty, Sulian says. We sit there together, watching the night sky emerge starless but illuminated, almost radioactive, like a glowing wound. At the demonstration, which has been going on for 4 decades now, and so different generations call it other things, like the rally or the march, there are always 2 sides. On one, many young adult people argue yes. On the other, a similar number of young adult people argue no. My heart lies on neither side, but it is part of the local culture to participate, so in the interest of fairness, I demonstrate for both. When on the yes side, there's optimism and hope, which the no side says is false and misleading. When on the no side, there's cynicism and fact-facing, which the yes side says is not productive in inaugurating change. The truth is, I believe we are all really hurting because of the crisis, especially since the last bird disappeared. I believe when we reach the end of birds whose genetic code outlived dinosaurs, people realized we were at the precipice of a whole new paradigm of being. I try to stay apolitical, which should be easy, but I only sort of succeed by playing for both sides. That I have a choice at all means I have an advantage, and I don't forget that. But sometimes, when I'm on one side and I see someone on the other side, whose face I was applying sunscreen to the day before, whose voice I have matched in chant, and whose hand I have held in solidarity, I have a thought that perhaps we have mistakenly identified as sides what are in fact two responses to the same threat. And if we only really sat down and talked about it, maybe cried about it, perhaps made art about it, we would come to realize this fact. When I think about what it would take to bring us together, I believe it would have to be a very beautiful and wordless song, one that requires a new scale of sound that hasn't been discovered yet. Then, I remember that birds taught early humans to sing, and I grow overwhelmed by the notion of change and want everything, even the demonstration, to stay strictly, exactly, completely as it is. Precisely 1 year to the day before the eclipse, the birds were acting strange. I noticed them on the 4th orbit of our town on Route 0. There were great flocks of them above us, but the flocks were composed of a myriad of different kinds of birds, jays and pigeons, robins and chickadees. I stopped the bus at a red light, and someone in the back of the bus said, "Look," and everyone peered out their windows. That night, as I was dropping off the last of the folks on my route, Sullivan moved to the front of the bus. I asked him what it meant, because I knew Sullivan knew birds better than any of us. "Something's coming," he said. And I said, "Of course, the eclipse." But then I saw Sullivan shake his head left to right in the rearview mirror. When birds are in danger, they flock together. They'll put aside their differences in size and shape and become a collective. It's a coping mechanism for some forthcoming disaster. I had looked behind me and let off 2 people, a no person and a yes person, and they scoffed at each other and bickered on their way off the bus. They were the last ones left, except for Sullivan, who stayed seated. So I put the bus in park, put on the brake, the emergency lights, and then turned around to face him. "I don't see what you are saying." He scooted a few seats down and leaned as close to me as he could while staying seated. "What I am saying is this. We are in the path of totality, perhaps in more than one way." The day I finally parked the bus and walked home from the depot for the last time, I remember I took the long way home and swung by Saturn to remind myself there are larger things at play than just me and my infinitesimal problems. Tonight, when I hear Yuri start, I knock 3 times on his wall and the crying stops and he knocks back, and I enter his duplex and walk up to his room, and he falls into me and I catch him. I lead him out to the porch, and Yuri lies across me and puts his hand on my lap, and I stroke his wings very gently, running the length of my fingers down the intricately webbed and networked wired lattice, and all the material tucked in that, together, compose his wings. Yuri is telling me that what you need to do is embody the character and suture yourself to it. It's not as if the part is separate from the you, he says, but the problem, he is telling me, the problem is that when you've done that, you start to lose any sense of control. The problem really is the fall. He knows it's coming every time, feels it en route. He knows each time he performs the play, He will be ending himself. You mean Icarus, I tell him. You will be ending Icarus, not yourself. Of course, he says, using a line from Act 2, Scene 1. But Yuri, I say, you've ended the play before the fall. You're actually saving him from that fate each and every time you perform it. I thought that's what I was doing, he tells me. But me and everyone out there, we know the real ending. And it's not just the ending of the story of Icarus. I'm talking about the crisis. Everyone knows what's coming, even if I choose not to show it to them. He is breathing really heavily, and he says suddenly louder, the trick is trying to forget where everything is leading. It's got to be the one and only time, every time I do it. I've got to forget what happens after the play ends, forget about the catastrophe. You know, sometimes, I say, I can hear myself speaking to myself. He looks up at me, and I stop stroking his wings. Sometimes I hear myself telling the story of myself. I don't know who I'm telling it to. He pulls away from me then, sits up, and looks at me head on. When I'm telling this story, the story of myself, I hear the way I'm creating this cohesive portrait of the person I am, of the things that are happening around me. I can hear that. But the truth is that between the way it feels and the way I tell it, there's this thin space, a cavity. When I try to translate what I'm feeling into language, even if that language is just in my head, something is lost. He looks at me then like I am on to something I don't need to tell him, but that I need to tell myself. What are you saying? That no one, not the narrator or the characters, not the actors or the audience, ever gets access to the real story. You can play the tape back 1,000,000 times. You can reread the story for eternity, and each time something will go unheard. He resumes his spot in my arms, and we are quiet for a while. Then I ask him if he'd like me to wash his wings. He stands up on the porch that has been his stage, and he nods his head up and down. But first, he says, can you help me molt? There's ephemera covering his wings, fabric braided in, pieces from board games, sea glass, a fake bird nest, several business cards, a dozen hair clips, a few pencils, 2 small spiral notebooks, a menu from a local restaurant, a crowd of dead flowers. We dismantle everything, one piece at a time. And when his wings are just the bare wire that Luce crafted for him all those weeks ago, I lead him into his side of the duplex and draw him a bath and undress him except for his wings. I test the water, then lead him into the bath, and I wash first his flesh with a cloth lathered with soap, and then I wash his wings still bound to his backs. I had forgotten how beautiful the wire was underneath all that decoration. When I soap them up, the light gets inside the spaces and they look like a bug's wings, all the colors shifting and morphing from pink to turquoise to yellow. I take swigs from my beer as I'm washing him, and I hum these low notes that remind me of the way a mourning dove would sound in the late afternoon, back when there were birds, and Yuri closes his eyes. I take the washcloth, and I lather it with soap, and I run it over him, over his pale arms, over his back, watch the way his wrinkled skin sags and pulls and moves like sand. I hum and run the cloth over him, and his eyes are closed, and it looks like he's going to cry, but then he smiles and starts humming too. He breaks only to reach for my beer, takes a swig before handing the can back to me, and we go back and forth like that, finishing it off, humming the loose memory of some gone species song. I am listening to Yuri, but as I listen, I am also thinking an unshared thought, a thought shared with no one at all. I get the feeling that I'm being observed, that someone else hears me, has admission to these thoughts. like the actors on the stage, but reversed. I'm not trying to forget the audience that clearly lies before me. I'm trying to identify spectators that remain invisible. I am washing Yuri's wings and listening to the bird song that comes from our human mouths, and I imagine then that this is all a rehearsal, a world in which I can press rewind and everything returns to some place before where it is now, and we, together, collectively, as one, together, we live it again. Of all of the endings Yuri wrote for the play, there is one that feels most true. I found it one day when I was picking up After the Triplets, the manuscript having slipped to the floor. There, in the mess of pages, was a single sheet with all the text crossed out, an X through the whole thing. And I did something I shouldn't have. I read it. The ending is this: Icarus plunges into the ocean. He thinks the water feels like sand against his body, and he imagines he is moving through the thinnest part of an hourglass, from the top of the glass to the bottom. It is only then, in the final moments of his life, that he realizes the strange logic of an hourglass, that if the sand is time, it moves from the future on the top to the past. It lets me imagine that maybe, somewhere out there, history is moving conversely, and soon, very soon, the universe will give birth to a new species that instills in us the longing to fly while reminding us that we never will. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. So I am more than happy to take questions if there are probing questions. I'm also going to very quickly just show you. So this is the, let me show you. This is the cover of the book, okay? And these are the covers we chucked. And I thought it was interesting to show you. You can see all the covers are in the middle, and then I just kind of did close-ups on either side to show you just tonally as writers. It's always kind of a useful exercise to think a little bit about, tone, which is that slippery kind of ephemeral, what do we feel when we read the book? It's useful, and I often ask my students to imagine or design their own cover to kind of encapsulate that tone. And here, all of the covers that we didn't use just didn't have the right tone. You guys just heard a little bit of the book. I feel like I wanted there to be just a little more hope. And maybe that hope, even though the book is full of all kinds of disaster and catastrophe, there is the sort of underlying thesis that the one thing we can do when faced with horror and disaster is make art. That is the thing we can do. We can make art. Art is central to human expression. And that is the one thing that we can do when faced with challenges of tragedy. And I didn't feel like these covers quite captured that. So what we ended up with is this other cover that to me, I think really does the work. It features the bird in a much more kind of overt way. And then we have this kind of inner story inside there, the book cover and inside the book cover that I felt like did a really good job of kind of speaking to the meta component to the book. So I'm gonna leave us kind of here. Do you have questions? I'm happy to answer them. I can talk all day, but I'd rather hear from you. Yes, question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Sorry, I didn't mean to yell. Oh, that's a fantastic question. I've failed at every other art form. I really want to be an actress, didn't work. Really want to be a painter, really bad. Desperately want to be a sculptor, didn't happen. The beauty of fiction is I can be all those things, right? You can sort of fictionally be all of those things. So I think there's maybe a way to answer this is sort of theory versus practice. I really wanted, and I do think the visual arts physicality, you know, a lot of writing is up here, but when we get into the world and engage physically with an art form, it's a very different sort of experience of making, of creating. So once upon a time, I was very interested in that. And in particular, the work that I did in theater, and you can see that kind of channeled through Yuri, but the work I did in theater, really, truly adopting the persona of a character feels a lot like a narrator adopting the persona of a character. I mean, they're actually incredibly similar undertakings. So while I failed in practice, a lot of the theory of these visual arts have made their way into my book. And I also I would cautiously call myself a formalist. I'm very, very interested in form, which is in part why the structure of the book, the nesting, that's always like the first thing that comes to me. And then from that form, I start to think about character and conflict and kind of metaphor. So for me, a lot of times the forms that I adopt come from the visual arts. Like I love Escher, his sort of paradoxes. And I always try to write a story that is an Escher-esque structure that can't be, but also is somehow. And so, so it's evolved quite radically because I failed a lot at all those other forms. Yes.
This is kind of a process question. It seems like because a lot of your books are published, you publish short excerpts.
Yeah.
And then they do end up having, even in Archive of Alternate Endings, like a pretty formal structure with the dates. And do those structures occur to you later in the process, or do you often get them early? Like at what point in your writing process does the structure of the final piece become clear to you?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So I actually don't really see myself as a short fiction writer. I'm always kind of thinking about a much larger book length project. And I think about the book as sorry to keep talking about vessels, but I think about the book as a vessel, right? And what can I do creatively and innovatively and experimentally? I have this opportunity, which is called the book. And what can I do? How can I stretch? How can I mold? So to me, I'm always working on books. And then what I use this short form for is a litmus test. Let me send out a little chunk of this and see if it gets published. Because if it does, then maybe people like this, or there's something going on that's kind of kinetic and seems like it's working. So it's almost the reverse of a lot of folks that I talk to who have turned shorter work into novels. It's they worked on a short piece and that kind of became an obsession for them, or they couldn't get out of that, and so they grew it out or further developed it. It's almost the opposite for me, where I'm always working in books, in the space of books, and then plucking out little chunks that I think could live alone. I don't know if that fully answers your question. So many probing questions. It's just a matter of who's going to raise their hand next. Yes. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm totally overwhelmed by this extraordinary close reading of the book. Thank you so much. It's really, really just a pleasure to hear. I think so first of all, it is difficult to write about the climate crisis because it is this kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of Sisyphean, almost Escher-esque sorrow and disgruntlement, and also hope and possibility, right? And that's a really hard thing to make come across in fiction. So this idea that you're picking up on the longing of all the characters, I'm so grateful that came through. I really think this is a product of that overarching kind of concept I was thinking about with solastalgia, which is this solace and nostalgia. And if you do an etymological, if you have a minute to take a look at the book, I like etymology a lot. There's a lot of like root words, word origin stuff going on in the book. But the etymology of nostalgia actually has nothing to do with time. We oftentimes think of like nostalgia as, oh, I nostalgia for my past or for my youth or for the place I used to live. But once upon a time, it just meant desiring to go back home. So I find that like idea of nostalgia that has evolved from being about home to now being about the past and the relationship between the past and home really, really interesting. And I think as we move through this sort of climate emergency, we're starting to re-see the world around us without certain kinds of, familiar touchstones that were once, even I was born in the 80s. I'm very, very old. I was born in the 80s. Even some of the sort of like natural, organic experiences that I had growing up are no longer. And so just that idea of this longing for what once was, but also the propulsion to keep moving forward and to have that, I think we must have hope. There must be some sense of the future. That felt really central to me. And I'm hoping, it sounds like maybe for some folks that maybe came through. Thank you so much for your fantastic question. So grateful to have a reader. It's like hard to get a reader. So it's like whenever someone's like, I read your book, I'm like, whew, someone out there read it. But also like, you write a book, and I'm not writing a book to change the world. I'm writing a book to connect with one other human, maybe that one right there, right? One other human on the other end of this like triangulation, me, the book, another person. And what's sort of magical to me is that by doing that, just speaking to one person, maybe that's a version of changing the world by having one other reader sort of rethink things or come to a new understanding or see the world slant so that they can see the world in front of them with a new set of eyes. Like that might be changing the world in a very, very small way. That's what I hope that we're trying to do with fiction. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I'm really, I'm ever moving toward allegory and metaphor and symbol. And a conversation I've been having with all my fiction writers lately is there's this very visceral fear of cliche. Everyone's so scared of being cliche. And look, like I wrote a book about birds. Like what is more cliche, right? Than like a book, like literature about birds. Done it, check. Well, everyone's done it. So for me, honestly, it's about juxtaposition. It's about taking something that feels really familiar and kind of putting it next to something that either also feels familiar, but the connection between them feels fresh and new, or putting it next to something that doesn't feel so familiar. So I did this in like my penultimate book, this other book that I wrote called The Archive of Alternate Endings, where I took Halley's Comet, which a lot of people have written about. It's not that strange. And then I took Hansel and Gretel, which, come on, everyone knows that story. And I put them together with the hope that, like, how can I make connections across these two very dissimilar things, which is the definition of metaphor, by the way, two unlike things being compared so that you see connections across them. I tried to do that in that book, and I think that's the way that we can kind of harness cliche or the familiar or these metaphors or symbols that are super, that everyone knows about, and somehow make it fresh and new. For me, that's really kind of the guts. And I would also say just a slight sort of like cheerleading for speculative fiction. I do think, and there are theorists who talk a lot about this, I do think that when it comes to these kind of hyper object, to use Timothy Morton's notion, like just these conceptual things that we can't comprehend, like the climate emergency. Using speculative fiction or metaphor symbol to think through that is actually, in many ways, much more fruitful. It's Emily Dickinson. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, right? Like you have to be defamiliarized or estranged to what's right in front of you every day to be able to re-see it. And I think that's what speculative fiction and allegory allows us. Yeah. I don't want you to be late for class. Oh, we've got like 1 minute. Last question, or are we done? We can be done, it's okay. Y'all, thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure. Thank you.